Welcome back, everyone. This is another episode of the Exodus Project. I'm your host, Steve Eisenhower, and today we are going to talk a little bit about Paul, how others felt about Paul, and as you can see from the title, the lawless one that he mentions in his writings. But before we get started, hit that subscribe button, turn on the notifications, give me a big thumbs up, and please check the description for any resource you may need, including my new book, The Christian Coloring Book. Also available on ebook version, available if you just shoot me an email at rediscoveringgod22@gmail.com. So let's hop right into it, the lawless one. Okay. So according to 2 Thessalonians 2, this is what Paul says regarding the lawless one. In verse 9 it reads, "The coming of the lawless one is by the activity of Satan." Okay, so lawless one, activity of Satan, with all power and false signs and wonders. Verse 10, "And with all wicked deception for those who are perishing, because they refuse to love the truth and so be saved." So I must ask the question, was Paul speaking about himself? His other letters and that of the letter of Hebrews, which was potentially written by Paul, but most certainly Pauline in theology, whether or not he was the true author, they assert that the Mosaic law is abolished and passing away through the death of Jesus. So I must ask the question, how can one be lawless in the absence of law? Right? Does that make sense? If the Mosaic law, if the Torah is being annulled, then how could there be a lawless one, right? There must in fact already be a preset law for one to be lawless and disagree with it, So how does that make sense? The typical Christian understanding is that this is the Antichrist, which if you're anti-Christ but also anti-law, that would assert that Christ was pro-law. So there's just a lot of issues going on here, especially when Paul was so strictly anti-law and goes against Jesus in his own teachings very often throughout the New Testament. So let's continue on. More of Paul's writings. Ephesians 2:15. "By abolishing in his flesh the enmity, which is the law of commandments." You don't get much more plain than that, right? That by his death and ultimately his resurrection, the commandments, the law, the Torah is abolished. So that in himself, he might make the two into one new man, thus establishing peace. Okay? Colossians 2:14. Mind you, everyone, these are Paul's writings, undisputedly from his hand, or at bare minimum of the Pauline persuasion, the Pauline school. So this is the Pauline train of thought regarding the Torah. Colossians 2:14. "Having canceled out the certificate of debt consisting of decrees against us, which was hostile to us, and he has taken it out of the way, having nailed it to the cross." What is the certificate of debt? The law. Because over and over, Paul says that the law is a schoolmaster showing us what we can't do, that we can't keep the Torah, that it's pointing to the essence of Christ, as it were, is what he would say. That the law is a curse. It is only there to show us how sinful we are. This is one of those main points. This is one of the main areas that it comes from, that those curses, the damning traits of the law that show us we're only disgusting sinners, was nailed onto a cross, and thus no longer binding or having any power over us. Just as we saw in Ephesians that in his flesh he abolished the enmity, which is the enmity, like disagreement or harsh feelings, which is the law of the commandments. So these two verses are very much saying the same thing. Okay, so let's continue on. Hebrews. So now we're into a book that like I said, is disputed, but is most certainly of Pauline persuasion and theology. For on the one hand, there is a setting aside, okay, there's a setting aside of the former commandment because of its weakness and uselessness. Thereby saying the Torah is weak and useless and that it's been set aside, okay, no longer binding. Hebrews 8:13. When he said a new covenant, he has made the first, which is the Torah, obsolete. Okay? There you get the Old Testament, New Testament, that type of thing. Hebrews is asserting here that the first covenant, the Mosaic covenant, is therefore obsolete. But whatever is becoming obsolete, meaning the Torah, and growing old, okay, is ready to disappear. Once again, hammering that, no pun intended, hammering that point home that the Torah is obsolete, it's abolished, it's no longer needed, it's weak, it's useless. And with this new covenant ushered in by the blood of Jesus, it's no longer relevant or needed. But keep in the back of your minds, people, the lawless one. So if the baseline message of what Paul was saying was that the law is annulled, right? That would make him lawless. So the question I posed at the beginning, is Paul talking about himself and his mode of thought? Hebrews 10, for the law, since it has only a shadow of the good things to come, and not the very form of things, meaning Jesus, can never by the same sacrifices which they offer continually, year by year, he's referencing Yom Kippur, make perfect those who draw near. Make perfect those who draw near. This is last sacrifice theology. Jesus was the last sacrifice according to them, saying that the Yom Kippur sacrifice only rolled the sins back a year. You're going to hear that from every Christian missionary out there. Every pastor is going to tell you that the offerings made in the temple only rolled sins back for a year, and they get it from this verse. So by Hebrews 10, the assertion is that not even the Torah's mode, whether or not he has it correct how it even works, right? Hebrews 10 is asserting that not even the Torah's prescribed way of atoning for one's sins is relevant or useful, which is why in the previous citation from Hebrews, he says that the old thing is weak and useless and passing away. Hebrews 12:27, the expression yet once more denotes the removing of those things which can be shaken, as of created things, so those things which cannot be shaken may remain. Can be shaken, meaning the Torah, okay, as of created things, that those things which cannot be shaken may remain. That's Jesus, because they believe he's an uncreated eternal being. Okay? Paul's writings were never meant to be a compilation, but rather they expose his chameleon-like nature of double speech and hypocrisy. And as we move on, we're going to see that even early church fathers and even potentially some apostles felt this way about Paul, that he was the lawless one, and that his mode of theology, though it was accepted in mass by the church, was actually not correct. Okay? So Tertullian, in 207, it says AD, but 207 CE, in his Against Heresies, he writes, Paul is the apostle of the heretics. That's a pretty tall charge. For someone in the early 3rd century, only 2 or 3 generations after this. In Latin, he called Paul hereticorum apostolus. He also stated in his Against the Heresies that Jesus never made Paul an apostle from the records that we can read. Okay, that's big. Bear in mind, people, I didn't write this. Tertullian did. This is a church father, and a very important one at that. Paul's claim to apostleship solely relies upon Paul's veracity, meaning the truthfulness of Paul, which we even see in his own writings that he has to reaffirm over and over again that he is telling the truth and is not a liar. You wouldn't have to do that if you weren't lying. He continues on that if Paul were a true apostle, he is still an inferior apostle because Paul in Acts 15 submitted his doctrine to the 12, right? Acts 15, Acts 21, you have a very similar account of Paul being questioned about what he's teaching by James, James giving a ruling and Paul submitting, right? Paul says, I confronted those so-called pillars to their face. Paul also says, I'm the apostle of apostles, right? So Paul thinks he's the most important person in the room, but even Tertullian says that no, if Paul even were a true apostle, he'd be inferior to the 12. And in other places, when we see Tertullian speaking regarding the Marcionites, he says that we can't deduce that because little history lesson, TLDR, Marcion really grabbed onto Paul. And the first Bible, which is Marcion's Bible, includes the Pauline letters, so we can see that it was all the Pauline letters and the book, a different version of the book of Luke. And he was very entranced. He was quite Gnostic. He was very into the Pauline theology. And Tertullian comes against that, and in his critique of Marcionism, he says basically that you adhere so strictly to Paul, but we don't even necessarily recognize Paul as an authoritative apostle. So it's clear these early church fathers, ones who were in their own right rather orthodox according to Christian understanding, didn't necessarily buy into everything Paul was selling. Further, he continues, if Paul later varied from the 12, we must regard the 12 as more authoritative than Paul because Paul came later. And this is very interesting that Tertullian is saying these things. Further, Paul's claim of being selected as an apostle later by Jesus seems implausible. Now that's about as damning as it gets. The story asks us to believe Jesus had not planned things adequately with the 12. Wow. But it's true. Tertullian makes a very good point there, that if we are to believe that Paul is a legitimate apostle, an apostle of apostles who gets to go to the third heaven and get these secret Kabbalistic teachings, why did the 12 not get that? Right? Why did it take this? Paul says, I'm an apostle to the Gentiles. We also see Peter and other apostles going to Gentiles, right? So why was Paul set apart in this esoteric, unverifiable way? Not that I even subscribe to Christianity. You guys know that. But if this Jesus figure did exist and the 12 were around him, how is it that a guy later, through this extremely esoteric experience that most of even his contemporary apostles didn't necessarily buy into, how does that set his authority above them, right? So, and Tertullian's pointing these things out, and I think that's very important. And now, finally, we have writings called the Clementine Homilies. Clement was, according to tradition, the hand-selected successor of Peter as the Bishop of Rome. And this is from those Clementine Homilies and is supposed to be, according to Clement, is a conversation, like a disputation between Peter and Simon Magus, who in these, Simon Magus is basically a code name for Paul. We don't know if they were tampered with by the church to make it seem like it's not Paul, but we can deduce from the teachings, not only in this homily or chapter, but from others. There are passages directly from Galatians cited on behalf of Simon Magus. So it's pretty clear that Paul is the topic of conversation here. We do even see in Galatians that Peter and Paul do have confrontations, so it would make sense. Further, James is greeted as the most authoritative of the leaders at the time, which we do find in Acts also. So when we see that Paul does in fact submit to James's rulings, we can understand, sure, there might be some legitimacy there, that James, the brother of Jesus, was the leader of the Jerusalem movement after the death of Jesus himself. So I would like to read, this is from Homily 17, chapter 19. This is supposed to be Peter speaking, and this is his direct polemic against Simon Magus, aka Paul. So, if then our Jesus appeared to you in a vision, made himself known to you, and spoke to you, it was as one who is enraged with an adversary. Now, mind you, this is Peter speaking, right? This is the rock upon whom I'll build my church. Okay? So let me read that again. If Jesus appeared to you in a vision, and made himself known to you, and spoke to you, it was as one who is enraged with an adversary. And this is the reason why it was through visions and dreams, or through revelations that were from without, that he spoke to you. But can anyone be rendered fit for instruction through apparitions? If you will say it is possible, then I ask, why did our teacher abide and discourse a whole year to those of us who were awake, meaning those who were alive? And how are we to believe your word when you tell us that he appeared to you? And how did he appear to you when you entertain opinions contrary to his teaching? Peter is basically saying to Paul here, why should we take you seriously when we were actually around the guy? We heard his teachings from his mouth. You just had some esoteric visitation, according to you, right? Continuing on. But if you were seen and taught by him, and became his apostle for a single hour, proclaim his utterances, interpret his sayings, love his apostles, contend not with me who companied with him. We even see in Acts that Paul's very much a contender against Peter. Says, I stood him down to his face, right? And if this is to be believed to be something Peter actually did say to Paul, write to Paul, however, he basically calls him out and says, if you were even his apostle for one single hour, right, 60 minutes, if you were his apostle for 1 hour, then just tell me what he said, right? Interpret his teachings. Don't give me opinions contrary to what he taught us. I was with the guy. Right? And don't contend with me, someone who actually was in his physical presence. Okay? That's Peter's whole argument here. For in direct opposition to me, who am rock, Peter, right, the foundation of the church, you now stand. Wow, that's a heavy charge. As I said, this is the rock on which I'll build my church. Okay? Peter is saying, I am the foundation of the church, handpicked by Jesus, right? And he's saying to Paul, you stand in direct opposition to me, and you have opinions contrary to that of Jesus himself. If you were not opposed to me, you would not accuse me, and revile the truth proclaimed by me, in order that I may not be believed when I state that I myself have heard with my own ears from the Lord, as if I were evidently a person that was condemned and in bad repute. But if you say that I am condemned, you bring an accusation against God, who revealed the Christ to me, and you inveigh against him who pronounced me blessed on account of the revelation. If this is legitimate, he's citing when Jesus asked his disciples, who do you say that I am? Peter says, you are the Christ, right? And he says, only God could have revealed such a thing to you. And like I said, can we trust the New Testament? Debatable. But if that episode did occur, we understand that Jesus was like, only the Spirit could have revealed that to you, not flesh and blood. But Peter, according to that, was, he was hand selected upon this rock while I build my church. So for Paul to accuse him that he's not a true apostle, he's teaching lies, Peter's basically saying, listen, man, I was handpicked by the guy himself. And he even told me that my revelation of him, he told me, right? The physical, tangible Jesus, according to Peter, told me that my assessment of who and what he was correct. Okay? You only had some esoteric vision, and how can we take that seriously? But if indeed you really wish to work in the cause of truth, learn first. Here's Peter's giving the ultimatum now. Live first. Learn first of all from us what we have learned from him. And become a disciple of truth, become a fellow worker with us. It was pretty clear. If the Clementine homilies are to be accepted, if they are legitimate, that Peter did have this conversation with Paul. It's pretty clear that the vast majority of the church, because we can see from these that James and Peter were in agreement, right? And they most certainly both disagree with Paul, and in fact said he was teaching lies, and that his revelation of Jesus was not to be trusted because what he was saying he was getting from Jesus was in stark contrast to those who actually met the guy. And we do see shades of that in Acts, in Paul's own writings, such as Galatians, where he very, very stringently comes against Peter and James. But then we also have in Acts in two places where Paul does in fact submit to the authority of James. Just as we see in the beginning of these Clementine homilies, Peter does as well. He greets James as most certainly the head honcho at the time. So that's all I have for you guys. But I'll end with the question: was Paul speaking about himself? Was that a redaction? Was that something added in later? Was Paul the lawless one? Throughout the teachings of his own writings and his school of thought later, if you don't accept Hebrews as being written by Paul, you see an annulling of the law, you see an annulling of the Torah. James in Acts says, we have many in our congregation that are zealous for the law, and they heard you are teaching that the law is annulled, and they're not happy about it. So the Clementines are legitimate, and Peter and Paul were still Torah observant. It's pretty obvious who the lawless one is. And Paul even says that the lawless one is working in the power of Satan, right? And I didn't include that homily here, but in that exchange between Peter and James, Peter basically tells James, how can we trust this guy? That vision he had may have been from the devil, right? Even the devil can appear as an angel of light, so maybe the devil gave him that vision. And that's in the exchange between Peter and James prior to this exchange with the man himself. So I'll leave it up to you guys. What do you think? In comparison to the rest of the apostles, according to Tertullian's opinion, Peter's opinion, the Clementine homily opinion, is Paul the lawless one? Is he the one who was working in the power of Satan, as it were? So something to consider, everybody. Just something to mull over. I hope it helped. I hope it bridged some gaps and makes things a bit more clear just on how much of a chameleon Paul was, and how even his own writings don't necessarily agree with each other. But at the base, his school of thought, which ended up taking over orthodoxy, was very anti-Torah, and the earliest church fathers didn't buy it. Tertullian, that's 3 or 4 generations after the first Christians, and he's saying at that point, that's 3rd century, even he's saying, how can we be so sure that we can trust Paul as an apostle? And if we can, he has to be inferior to the 12. That's a very important point, right? And just one more final point to hammer home is Peter himself in the Clementines, if they're legitimate, says that Paul was teaching things that were contrary to even Jesus' own teachings, which, if you've watched anything by me and Davon together, or however, we've brought it out that Paul taught in stark contrast to Jesus. Peter reprimands him for standing in contention with those who companied against Jesus, or company with Jesus. Once again, we see that in the New Testament as well. And that he was a direct opposition to Peter himself, which once again, even Paul admits in Galatians that he stood down Peter to his face. Right? So, hope that helps everyone. Hope that made some sense. Yeah. Until next time, I'm Steve Eisenhower. This was the Exodus Project. Have a good one, everybody.